Some stories start with a single moment that changes everything. This one began the night Sophia blocked a man's number, and he showed up at her door anyway. What you're about to hear is a fictional story inspired by real romance experiences shared by viewers like you. If you love stories about second chances and the kind of connection that refuses to be ignored, hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Sophia had blocked Joseph Adams's number at 11:37 on a Thursday night, standing in her kitchen with a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Her thumb hovered over his name for almost a minute before she did it. Not because she was unsure, because she knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why it terrified her. The date had been fine. Better than fine if she was honest, which she was trying very hard not to be. They'd met 6 weeks earlier at a private viewing for emerging artists, one of those events where Sophia represented the gallery and spent most of the night smiling politely at men who thought buying art meant buying access to her. Joseph hadn't bought anything. He'd stood in front of a single painting for 20 minutes, asked her 3 questions about the artist's use of negative space, and then asked if she'd have dinner with him. She'd said no 4 times before saying yes. The restaurant had been quiet, candlelit in a way that felt intentional rather than trying too hard. He'd asked about her work, her life, the scar on her wrist she usually kept covered. Not in the way men ask when they're collecting information to use later, but in the way someone asks when they actually want to know. And she'd told him. Not everything, never everything, but more than she'd planned. That was the problem. Joseph Adams was the kind of man who made you forget the rules you'd spent years building. Successful, obviously. He'd mentioned consulting work in Singapore, a firm he'd started, the kind of details that suggested money without needing to announce it. But it wasn't the success that unsettled her. It was the attention. The way he listened like her words mattered. The way he'd reached across the table once, just once, to brush his thumb across her knuckles when she'd gone quiet, and she'd felt that single touch everywhere. She'd excused herself to the bathroom and stayed there for 5 minutes, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to remember why she didn't do this anymore. Why men like him, charming, intense, too interested too fast, were dangerous. By the time he'd walked her to her car, she'd already decided. He'd kissed her cheek, lingered just long enough that she felt his breath against her temple, and asked when he could see her again. She'd smiled and said she'd text him. She blocked his number instead. 2 days later, on Saturday evening, someone knocked on her apartment door. Sophia almost didn't answer. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the building had a buzzer system that visitors were supposed to use. But the knock came again, softer this time, and something made her check the peephole. Joseph stood in the hallway holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Not roses, not the expensive, arranged kind that men sent when they were trying to prove something. Just wildflowers, slightly uneven, wrapped in brown paper. Sophia's hand was on the deadbolt before she realized what she was doing. She opened the door halfway. He didn't smile. Didn't apologize for showing up uninvited. Just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name and said, "You felt it too. That's why you blocked me." It wasn't a question. Sophia should have closed the door. That's what the rational part of her brain kept insisting. The part that had survived a relationship that left bruises you couldn't see. The part that had learned the hard way that intensity wasn't the same as safety. But she didn't close it. She stepped back instead, just enough to let him in, and watched as Joseph walked past her into the small entryway of her apartment. He set the flowers on the console table by the door, careful not to disturb the stack of art catalogs she'd left there. Then he turned to face her, and the space between them felt impossibly small. She crossed her arms, more to steady herself than anything else. "Tell me I'm wrong," he'd said. And the problem was, he wasn't. She had felt it. That pull during dinner, the one that made her hands shake when he'd touched her. The kind of attraction that didn't announce itself politely. It just took up residence in your chest and refused to leave. That's exactly why she'd blocked him. Because men who made you feel that much, that fast, were the ones who could destroy you when they left. He seemed to understand her silence. Instead of pushing, he glanced around her apartment, the exposed brick, the second-hand furniture she'd refinished herself, the single abstract painting above the couch that she'd bought with her first real paycheck. His gaze lingered on it for a moment before returning to her. He told her he hadn't come to pressure her. He just needed her to know that walking away from dinner feeling like that, like something fundamental had shifted, wasn't normal for him either. He said he'd spent 2 days trying to respect her decision, and he couldn't. Sophia felt something crack open in her chest. She asked him how he'd found her address. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. He admitted he'd remembered the name of her building from a conversation they'd had weeks ago at the gallery, some passing comment she'd made about the neighborhood. He'd taken a chance. She should have been angry, should have told him that showing up uninvited was exactly the kind of behavior she'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. But there was something in the way he stood there, not crowding her space, not demanding anything, that felt different. He wasn't trying to charm his way past her defenses. He was just asking her to be honest about what she'd felt. And maybe that was worse. Because honesty required vulnerability, and vulnerability was something Sophia had stopped offering years ago. She told him she'd blocked his number because she didn't trust herself around him. The words came out quieter than she intended, but they came out. Something shifted in his expression, not triumph, but relief. He stepped closer, slowly enough that she could have moved away if she wanted to. She didn't. When he reached up to brush a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers barely grazed her cheek, but she felt the touch like a current running under her skin. He asked if he could take her to dinner again. Properly this time, he said. No running. Sophia looked up at him, at the way he was watching her like she was something worth waiting for, and felt the last of her resistance start to fracture. She told him yes, but just dinner. He smiled then, just barely, and it was the first time she'd seen him look anything less than completely in control. He said dinner was enough. When he left, the wildflowers were still sitting on her console table. Sophia stood there for a long time after the door closed, her fingers pressed against the spot on her cheek where he'd touched her, knowing she'd just agreed to something far more dangerous than dinner. Their second dinner happened 3 nights later at a small Italian place in the West Village that didn't take reservations. Joseph had texted her the address. She'd unblocked his number the morning after he'd left her apartment, though she hadn't told him that. And when Sophia arrived, he was already waiting outside, hands in his pockets, looking less polished than he had before. No suit this time, just dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his eyes look almost gray in the streetlight. He smiled when he saw her, and she felt that pull again, the one she'd been trying to convince herself she'd imagined. They waited 40 minutes for a table, standing close together on the sidewalk while other couples came and went. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk. Instead, he asked her about the painting in her apartment, the abstract one above the couch, and whether she'd ever wanted to create art herself or just help other people sell it. The question surprised her. Most people assumed curating was a fallback, something you did when you couldn't make it as an artist. But Joseph seemed genuinely curious, so she told him the truth, that she'd painted once, years ago, before a relationship that slowly convinced her that everything she made was worthless. She hadn't picked up a brush since. He didn't apologize or tell her she should start again. He just nodded, like he understood that some things break in ways that don't heal neatly. Then he admitted something too, that his company had been his ex-wife's idea originally, and after the divorce he'd almost shut it down because keeping it felt like holding on to something that wasn't his anymore. But he didn't. He rebuilt it into something different instead. Sophia looked at him, at the way he was watching her, and realized they were having a different conversation entirely. They were both talking about what it meant to start over when the old version of yourself didn't work anymore. Dinner was easier after that. The restaurant was loud and cramped, the kind of place where tables were so close together you could hear your neighbors' conversations. Joseph ordered in Italian, not showing off, just comfortable, and when the wine came, he poured hers first without asking if she wanted any. She did. They talked about work, travel, the exhibit she was planning for November. He told her about Singapore, about deals that had fallen through and ones that hadn't, about the strange loneliness of hotel rooms in cities where you don't speak the language. She told him about her sister in Boston, the one who called every Sunday and worried too much, and about the gallery owner who'd given her a chance when no one else would. It should have felt like a normal date, but every time his knee brushed hers under the table, or his hand lingered near hers when he reached for the bread basket, Sophia felt the air shift between them. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of tension that made it hard to focus on anything except the space he took up and the way her body responded to it without permission. After dinner, they walked. No destination, just blocks and blocks through the village while the October air turned cold enough to see their breath. At some point, Joseph reached for her hand. Not asking, just taking it, his fingers warm and sure around hers. She didn't pull away. They ended up outside her building again, and this time when he kissed her, it wasn't on the cheek. It was slow and deliberate, his hand sliding into her hair while her back pressed against the brick wall of the entrance. She felt the kiss in places that had nothing to do with her mouth. Her throat, her ribs, the base of her spine. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and she could feel him breathing as hard as she was. He asked if he could see her again soon, not in 3 days, tomorrow. Sophia nodded before she could think better of it. Tomorrow turned into every day for 2 weeks, coffee before Sophia's morning meetings, lunch in parks when the weather held, dinners that stretched past midnight in restaurants they picked at random. Joseph fit himself into her life so seamlessly that she almost didn't notice it happening, until she realized she was thinking about him during client calls, checking her phone between appointments, rearranging her schedule just to see him an hour earlier. It should have scared her. Instead, it felt inevitable. 3 weeks after that first real dinner, Joseph invited her to his place. Not his apartment in the city, he kept one in Tribeca for work, but his actual home, a renovated townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, that he said he barely used anymore because it felt too big for one person. Sophia knew what the invitation meant. They'd been careful until now, keeping things slow despite the current that ran between them every time they touched, but careful had an expiration date, and they were both aware they'd reached it. She showed up on a Saturday evening with a bottle of wine she'd probably spent too much time choosing. Joseph answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. The house was beautiful in an understated way. High ceilings, original hardwood, furniture that looked expensive but comfortable. He'd cooked, which surprised her. Pasta, simple but perfect, and they ate at the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room because it felt less like a performance that way. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Sophia sat on the couch, wine glass in hand, and Joseph sat close enough that their knees touched. They talked about nothing important, a documentary he'd watched, a book she was reading, but the conversation kept trailing off into silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, the kind that hummed with everything they weren't saying. At some point, Joseph set his glass down and turned toward her. He didn't ask permission this time. He just kissed her, and it was nothing like the kiss outside her building. This one was hungrier, more certain, his hand sliding along her jaw and down the side of her neck in a way that made her breath catch. Sophia let herself fall into it. She'd spent weeks keeping a careful distance, and the relief of closing that gap was almost overwhelming. When his mouth moved to the spot just below her ear, she felt her entire body respond, leaning into him without thinking. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb brushing across her bottom lip. Then he asked if she wanted to stay. She should have hesitated. Should have reminded herself that this was exactly the kind of moment where things got complicated. But she didn't want to be careful anymore. She wanted him, wanted this, wanted to stop running from the one thing that had felt real in longer than she could remember. So she said yes. Joseph stood and held out his hand, and Sophia took it. He led her upstairs to a bedroom that was all clean lines and soft light, and when he kissed her again, it was slow and deliberate, like he was memorizing the shape of her. She let him pull her sweater over her head, felt his hands slide down her sides, and for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what came next or what could go wrong. She was just there, present, wanting. They took their time. Every touch built on the last one, every kiss deeper than the one before. And when they finally came together, skin against skin, It felt like something breaking open and settling into place all at once. Sophia lost track of time, lost track of everything except the way he moved against her, the sound of his breathing, the heat of his mouth on her throat. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the dark, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying, but somewhere in the quiet, Sophia realized she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she had no idea what happened next. The job offer came on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after that first night at Joseph's townhouse. Sophia was sitting at her desk at the gallery when the email arrived. A position in Los Angeles, heading the contemporary art department at a museum she'd admired for years. The kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. The kind that required an answer within 2 weeks. She stared at the screen for a long time before closing her laptop. That evening, she met Joseph at his place. He could tell something was wrong the moment she walked in, but he didn't push. He just poured her a glass of wine and waited. When she finally told him, he went very still. Then he asked what she wanted to do. Sophia said she didn't know. It was the truth. For the first time in her career, a professional decision felt impossible to make because it meant choosing between the work she'd spent years building toward and a man she hadn't planned on needing this much. Joseph didn't tell her to stay. He didn't promise to follow her or suggest long distance or offer any of the easy answers she half expected. He just looked at her for a long moment and said he couldn't ask her to give up something that mattered. But he also couldn't pretend he was okay with losing her. The honesty broke something open in Sophia's chest. Because that was the difference, wasn't it? He wasn't trying to convince her or control the outcome. He was just telling her the truth, even when it hurt. She spent the next week thinking, weighing, imagining her life in California, the career, the sun, the clean slate, and then imagining it without Joseph, without the way he showed up when he said he would. Without the morning, she woke up in his bed to find him already awake, watching her like she was something he couldn't quite believe was real. On Saturday, she called the museum and turned down the offer. When she told Joseph, he didn't celebrate. He just pulled her close and asked if she was sure. She said yes, not because she was choosing him over her career, but because she was choosing the life she actually wanted instead of the one she thought she was supposed to want. He kissed her then, slow and deep, his hands framing her face like she was something precious. And Sophia realized she'd spent so long protecting herself from the wrong things. The real risk wasn't loving someone who could hurt her. It was walking away from someone who saw her completely and stayed anyway. Later, as they sat together on his couch, her head on his shoulder, Joseph mentioned he'd been thinking about opening an office in Brooklyn, spending less time traveling, building something more permanent. Sophia smiled against his shirt. She told him that sounded good. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to look forward to. What did you think of Sophia and Joseph's story? Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. I'd love to know what you felt. Thank you so much for being here and letting me share this story with you. A new story is coming soon. Don't miss it. Bye.